Greetings, students. Welcome to the second topic on new medical technologies. And in this topic, I'm going to talk about more specifically about new reproductive technologies. So, in the last lecture, you saw how understanding of health, understanding of body has transitioned, has evolved from a biomedical understanding to a more sociological, to a more social science understanding of holistic understanding of health of the body. Um, we will bring in that lens, that apparatus here to understanding the interventions of technology, medical technologies, in understanding concepts around reproduction. So, when we talk of the understanding of digital reproductive healthcare practices, particularly from a sociological perspective, we can look at it across two levels of understanding. One is the discourse of digital reproductive healthcare. What are some of the theoretical parameters, theoretical discussions around the understanding of digital reproductive healthcare? And the second layer of understanding is to bring in digital reproductive healthcare praxis perspective, or the practices that people engage in. And these two layers of understanding are not discrete, in the sense they inform each other, they inflect each other, and they evolve together in the term that discourse and praxis would in conventional sense of the terms. So these two domains have identified the social practices, relationships, and identities that are configured and reproduced via digital health technologies. So these two lenses, they actually go beyond simple description of the ways in which people use health medical websites. In fact, they have shed attention on how knowledge, how social relations, and even power structures, power relations are generated and circulated in these forums and societies. So they are very powerful tools, very powerful concepts, very powerful apparatus that look at how social relations are affected, morphed in this context. So we have seen in the literature the idea of digital embodiment, as I have spoken about it in a previous topic. And we have seen how social scientists, particularly sociologists and cultural analysts, have looked at the idea of a pre-given natural body, has challenged that idea, and they have looked at how configuring and reconfiguring the body in certain ways have taken place with the advent and interventions of technology. So what has happened is that medical technologies have produced knowledge about the intervention into human bodies, and this has been there for a very long time. Before the advent of the digital, the idea of the biomedical, the idea of the medical condition of the body, have been redefining the idea of the body in the sense, what is constituted as normal body, what is constituted as deviant body, what is constituted as healthy body, what is constituted as pathological body, so on and so forth. So, medical science has sort of given us some of these boundaries to understanding the conditions of the body. But when we superimpose the social science, the sociological perspective of that understanding of the body, it becomes a little more complicated. And when we bring in an additional lens of technology to understanding that sense of health and the body, it becomes further complicated to understand how the body is understood. So what happens is that we have new forms of technological embodiment And the human body, which has now become conceptualized in terms of computational images, for example, and data that is a data driven understanding of the body. And data has become a new way of accessing and monitoring the body, that has been understood in biomedical terms. And we have seen, again, how the idea of the cyborg, for example, previous writings on health and the body have looked at the understanding of digitized bodies. And they have invoked the idea of, the cyborg, professed by Donna Haraway, and the concept of the digital cyborg assemblage sort of moves on from a more static concept to a more dynamic concept of contemporized digitized bodies. So the idea of cyborg again comes in as a helpful lens to understanding what the body means, or what health means in this context. Um, and then cyborg assemblages in the digital sense are configured when human actors interact with digital technologies. So, for example, as prosthetic technologies, digital devices extend the capacities of the body by supplying data that can then be used to display the body's limits and capabilities. So, for example, if you wear a smart device, a smart watch, for example, and then you monitor, some of your bodily functions using that smart device, that then becomes a site of inquiry. That is your body then a product of the data that is being derived from the digital device that you are wearing. So the concept of the body then, goes various iterations, various redefinitions, with the interference, with the emergence, and the actions of the technologies that we use in order to monitor health and the body. So, in this concept, let me bring in the idea of a technology that has been profoundly influencing the body, and the understanding of health and society, in the context of reproduction. And this is assisted reproductive technologies, or ARTs, as they are well known as. So, ARTs are a response to a global health phenomena of infertility. And infertility affects more than 15% of all reproductive aged couples across the world. And this affects over 80 million women and men worldwide. It is a global health condition. And ARTs are a direct response to this health condition of that people encounter across the world. In fact, about 8 or 9 years ago in 2016, the Indian Express published an article entitled A Social Stigma, the Business of Egg Freezing in India, quote unquote. And they had this following spotlight description in the news article, that, and I quote, people in India still express outrage over the idea of freezing eggs, especially in joint and conservative families. So, as you can see, that the idea of intervention of medical technologies into a sphere that is so intimate, such as reproduction, has traveled a variety of social institutions, such as family, marriage, and even the national platform. And has sort of redefined the whole idea of body and health and the self. A few months later, after this article was published in 2016, the same year, the Times of India published a similar story. And this time, they posed a question, and this question being, quote unquote, should you freeze your eggs? And over the last 8 or 9 years, there have been many, many such articles that have been published in popular magazines, in newspapers, and a lot of research has been done in this context to look at what happens when there is a medical intervention, a technological intervention, in as intervening as in the body in the case of reproductive practices. So in this context, it is helpful to look at this chart of in the context of global infertility, and with the advent of reproductive technologies, particularly looking at this intimate sphere of life, what are some of the social consequences, some of the social impacts that raises questions of embodiments and subjectivities, giving us into new directions of kinship, family, marriage, so on and so forth, and also at the same time opening doors for discussions on ethical practices such as embryo ethics, and all of these culminating into the most recent version of the ART Act, the Assisted Reproductive Technologies Regulation Act 2021 in India. And just to give you a little bit of social background context to this discussion, that is, it's not, we are talking about technology and healthcare and medical practices, but there is a larger social context that is guiding this discussion. And in this context, in the context of assisted reproductive technologies, there is distinct social impact, social consequences when couples have a health condition of infertility, and it often impacts social institutions of family, impacts social institutions of marriage, in the form of social ostracisms, in the form of stigmatization, either of the person or of the couple or of the family across scales. So they have very distinct social impacts, social consequences that they bring with it in an understanding of this, health condition. So the idea of Assisted Reproductive Technology Regulation Act of 2021 has a background to it. And they define ARTs to a range of fertility treatments aimed at aiding reproduction for couples suffering from infertility or to persons who may wish to have a child through artificial methods. These arrangements include in vitro fertilization, gamete donation, and gestational surrogacy, where the child is not biologically related to the surrogate mother. So, as you can see, that the idea of medical intervention travels and traverses across a variety of these social institutions of family, of marriage, of the self, and helps in redefining understandings of digital embodiment, understandings of how marriage, how family is organized or defined. So I would read out a little bit of the introduction of the Act of Assisted Reproductive Technology Regulation Act of 2021 in India. So the Assisted Reproductive Technology Regulation Act 2021, and I'm going to read out the introductory part of this act here, quote unquote, an act for the regulation and supervision of the assisted reproductive technology clinics and the assisted reproductive technology banks, prevention of misuse, safe and ethical practice of assisted reproductive technology services for addressing the issues of reproductive health, where assisted reproductive technology is required for becoming a parent or for freezing gametes, embryos, embryonic tissues for further use due to infertility, disease, or social or medical concerns, and for regulation and supervision of research and development, and for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto, close quote. So, as you can see from the introduction of the ART Act of 2021, coming to a very sociological social science understanding, there are important contexts of embodiment of subjectivities that assisted reproductive technologies raise. And many scholars have looked at ART practices as gendered practices, as gendered technologies, with highly specific differentiated applications on women's and men's bodies. And some scholars have argued that such practices, such technological interventions are more invasive on women's bodies than on other bodies. For example, through practices of super ovulation or injecting hormones and so on and so forth. And many scholars have also pointed out another important dimension of social impact is that as an unintended consequences, the very existence of assisted reproductive technologies may serve to reinforce the cultural quote-unquote motherhood mandate for women in many societies. So where the expectation is that married women would have children, the motherhood mandate becomes even more explicit with the advent and the presence of assisted reproductive technologies. And it has also been voiced in the literature, in research on ART practices, technologies, that in most societies, the concept of infertility gets highlighted if the condition is diagnosed for a woman. In case of male infertility, the diagnosis remains deeply hidden, since the ideas of male infertility is also tied to understandings of masculinities across societies and cultures. So, going through this route of looking at some of the critical areas of inquiry that assisted reproductive technologies have raised in societies, many scholars have also pointed out how ARTs have been an example of stratified reproduction, in the sense that it is the idea of access to ARTs, access to this form of technologies, reflect a pronounced, class-based or, other axis of differentiations that are highlighted. And therefore, they sort of yield, a stratified form of reproduction and yielding further inequalities. Technologically assisted reproduction is largely restricted to some of the global elite groups, whereas if people are not from a wealthier class, not from a quote unquote elite class, they sort of do not have access to these technological practices, which are highly expensive oftentimes, and that is what scholars have sort of voiced in this research, is that ART practices have given rise to stratified forms of reproduction. The other aspect that research looks at in this context is the concept of embryo ethics. And the practice of egg freezing and egg donation has brought in a lot of debate, has brought in a lot of discussion around the ethics of egg donation and the ethics around embryo donation, and so on and so forth. But what most of these scholarship, point towards is an understanding of new directions in the form of kinship and family studies, which has been one of the long-standing, social institutions in any given society. So the advent of assisted reproductive technologies have brought in, for example, with the practice of surrogacy, for example, or egg donation, for example, they have sort of destabilized the understanding of biological understanding of the family, the biological understanding that kinship rests on. And they have also sort of challenged the idea of family and parenthood through the heteronormative lens only. In fact, in the ART Act of 2021, one of the striking features of that act is to call for an inclusion of single parent and LGBTQAI plus community into the domain of practices of ARTs, but discussions in this respect are still ongoing. But what has happened is that the introduction of ARTs, across many countries has actually led to what scholars have called, quote unquote, the queering of reproduction. So, with this, I come to a conclusion to this topic, drawing your attention to two areas of future direction that new reproductive technologies have raised and opened doors for discussions. The first is remaking private-public knowledge production networks and forms of expertise in reproductive health. In the sense that digital platforms, fertility tracking applications, they link the private and the public actors, and a lot of data is generated in the process. So how data is collected, used, and shared in these networks is something to critically look at in this context. And the second aspect that I would like to draw your attention to is while the topic of digital social inequalities has received attention, very few studies have actually focused on the implications for people's access and the use of such digital health technologies. So I would like to draw your attention to these two, areas of inquiry about the data that is being generated, shared, and used across networks, and about the implications of people's access or not having access to such technologies having an impact on the body, health, and society. Thank you very much.